The session musicians at Olympic Studios looked at Bob Marley like he was speaking a foreign language, which, in a way, he was. "It's too simple," one of them said, setting down his bass guitar. "3 chords, same rhythm? Where's the complexity? Where's the musicianship?" Bob tried to explain. "It's not about complexity, man. It's about the feeling, the spirit. Reggae speaks to the soul, not just the ears." "Soul doesn't sell records," the drummer replied. "This is London. Rock sells, blues sells. Whatever this is, it's not going to work here." Bob felt the familiar weight of being misunderstood. He'd been in London for 3 months, trying to get his music heard by British record labels. Everyone said the same thing. Too simple, too different, too foreign, not commercial enough for the UK market. What none of them knew was that Jimi Hendrix was in the next studio, finishing his own session, and through the walls, he'd been listening to Bob's struggle, listening to music that spoke a language he recognized but had never heard expressed quite like this. And when Jimmy walked into Bob's session and picked up a guitar to show those musicians what they were really hearing, Bob Marley started crying. Not from sadness, but from the overwhelming joy of finally being understood. This is the story of the moment reggae found its voice in rock and roll London, and the night 2 musical souls recognized each other across genres, cultures, and continents. Olympic Studios, London, March 10, 1970. The most famous recording studio in Britain, where the Beatles had recorded, where the Rolling Stones had made their biggest hits, where every major artist came to capture the sound that would define their career. Bob Marley was there because his manager had convinced Island Records to give reggae a chance. "Just 1 session," they'd said. "See if you can make it work for British audiences." But 3 hours into the session, nothing was working. The session musicians, some of Britain's best, couldn't connect with the reggae rhythm. The producer kept asking for more energy, more excitement, and everyone seemed to think that Bob's songs needed to be improved to work in the UK market. "What if we speed it up?" suggested the guitarist. "Make it more like rock." "What if we add a guitar solo?" suggested the producer. "Something British audiences can relate to." Bob felt his heart sinking. This was exactly what he'd feared, that to succeed in the international music business, he'd have to change his music into something it wasn't, that reggae would have to become rock or blues or anything except what it actually was. "The music is perfect as it is. It doesn't need to be changed. It needs to be understood." "But how do we make people understand?" the producer asked. "British audiences don't know this sound. They need something familiar to connect with." That's when the studio door opened and Jimi Hendrix walked in. Jimmy had been recording in Studio B, working on tracks for what would become The Cry of Love. But through the studio walls, he'd been hearing something that intrigued him, a rhythm he'd never encountered before, a musical approach that felt both ancient and revolutionary. "Sorry to interrupt, but I couldn't help hearing what you're working on. Mind if I listen?" Bob looked up, recognizing the most famous guitarist in the world, Jimi Hendrix, the man who'd redefined what guitar could do, what rock could be. "Of course, brother, though I'm not sure how much longer we'll be working. These musicians think my music needs to be different." Jimmy looked around the studio, saw the frustrated expressions on the session musicians' faces, heard the tension between artistic vision and commercial pressure. "Play me one of your songs," to Bob. "Just you, just your voice, and your guitar." Bob picked up his acoustic guitar and started singing "No Woman, No Cry." His voice carried the spiritual weight of Jamaica, the rhythm of Rastafari of faith, the melody of hope despite struggle. The session musicians listened politely, but Jimmy heard something else. He heard the spaces between the notes, the way Bob's voice curved around the melody, the spiritual intention behind every phrase. When Bob finished, Jimmy was quiet for a moment. "Can I try something?" asked Jimmy. He picked up an electric guitar, plugged it into the amplifier, and began to play. But he wasn't playing guitar in any traditional sense. He was singing Bob's song with 6 strings. Every vocal inflection that Bob had just performed, Jimmy recreated with his guitar. Every curve of melody, every spiritual emphasis, every moment where Bob's voice had reached for something beyond words, Jimmy's guitar found it. The opening notes of No Woman, No Cry came alive in a way that no one in that studio had ever heard before. Not as a guitar interpretation of a vocal melody, but as if the guitar had become Bob's voice itself. Jimmy bent the strings to match Bob's vocal vibrato, used feedback to echo the spiritual longing in Bob's phrasing, made the electric guitar speak with a Jamaican accent, carry Rastafarian faith, express Caribbean soul.
The session musicians stopped what they were doing and listened, really listened. For the first time that day, they heard what Bob had been trying to show them. This wasn't simple music. This was sophisticated music that achieved its power through spiritual depth rather than technical complexity. This was music that spoke to something beyond the intellect. And Bob Marley, hearing his own voice coming through Jimmy's guitar, started crying. Not sad tears, tears of recognition. Tears of finally being understood by another musician who heard what he was really doing. "My God," Bob whispered, "you hear it. You hear the soul." Jimmy continued playing, moving through the song with an understanding that went beyond musical technique. He'd found the spiritual core of reggae and was expressing it through rock instrumentation. The electric guitar became a voice of praise. The amplification became spiritual amplification. Rock technology served reggae soul. When Jimmy finished playing, the studio was completely quiet. The bassist, who'd complained about simplicity, was staring at his instrument like he'd never seen it before. The drummer, who demanded more energy, realized he'd been missing the point entirely. The producer, who'd wanted to make the music more British, understood that the music didn't need to change. The listeners needed to open their minds. "That's reggae," Bob said, tears still in his eyes. "That's what I've been trying to tell you. It's not about the complexity of the notes. It's about the depth of the feeling." Jimmy set down the guitar and looked at Bob. "Your music is perfect as it is. Don't change anything. The world needs to learn to hear what you're already saying." "But how?" asked Bob. "How do I make them understand without someone like you to translate?" "You don't translate," Jimmy said. "You just keep being authentic. The people who are ready to hear it will hear it, and eventually everyone else will catch up." The session producer, who'd been pushing for commercial changes, made a decision that would change the direction of the recording. "We're not changing anything," he announced. "We're going to record Bob's music exactly as he intended it, and we're going to trust that British audiences are smart enough to recognize something special when they hear it." The session musicians, who'd been struggling to connect with reggae, asked Bob to teach them, not how to change reggae into rock, but how to support reggae as reggae. "Show us how to honor your music," the bassist said. "Not how to improve it, but how to serve it." For the next 4 hours, Bob and Jimmy worked with the session musicians to create something that had never existed before. Reggae recorded with rock studio quality, but maintaining its spiritual authenticity. Jimmy didn't play on the recordings. This was Bob's music, not a collaboration. But he stayed in the studio, offering guidance, helping the other musicians understand what they were serving. "Feel the space between the beats," Jimmy would say. "That's where the spirit lives. Don't try to fill every moment with sound. Let the silence speak. The rhythm isn't just a pattern, it's a prayer." When they finished recording that night, everyone in the studio knew they'd been part of something significant. Not just a recording session, but a cultural bridge being built. Bob shook Jimmy's hand, but then pulled him into an embrace. "You saved reggae in this country tonight, brother," Bob said. "You showed these musicians that my music doesn't need to change to be understood. It just needs to be heard with open hearts. Your music saved itself. I just helped them hear what you've been saying all along." The recordings from that session became some of Bob Marley's most successful early work in the UK market. British radio stations began playing reggae. British audiences began understanding the spiritual power behind the simple rhythms. And music journalists began writing about the night that Jimi Hendrix guitar spoke Jamaican. Years later, Bob would often tell the story of that recording session, about the moment when the greatest guitarist in the world made his guitar sing like a Rastafarian voice, about the tears that came from finally being understood. "Jimmy showed me that music has no borders, that a guitar can speak any language if the player has love in their heart. That night, his guitar spoke my language better than I'd ever heard it spoken." The recordings from that session became some of Bob Marley's most successful early work in the UK market. British radio stations began playing reggae. British audiences began understanding the spiritual power behind the simple rhythms. And music journalists began writing about the night that Jimi Hendrix guitar spoke Jamaican.
Jimmy would later say that playing Bob's music taught him something important about his own guitar playing. "I learned that the highest level of technique is when you can disappear into the music completely," Jimmy said, "when the instrument becomes transparent and all that's left is the soul of the song. Bob's music taught me that. The guitar isn't supposed to be the star, the feeling is supposed to be the star." The moment became legendary among musicians, the night that genres dissolved, the evening when rock and reggae recognized each other as spiritual siblings, the session when two masters taught each other about the deepest purposes of music. But for Bob Marley, the most important part of the story was simpler than all of that. For the first time since arriving in London, he'd felt heard. Not just his music, but his soul. And those tears he'd cried when Jimmy's guitar sang his song, those were tears of a musician who'd found a brother in an unexpected place. "Music is love," Bob always said, and that night at Olympic Studios, love spoke fluent guitar. If this story of musical understanding, transcending genres and cultures, moved you, hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Share it with someone who's felt misunderstood in their creative expression. Have you ever experienced that moment when someone truly understood your artistic vision? Tell us in the comments, and don't forget to hit that notification bell for more stories about the moments when music became a universal language of the soul.